One of the interesting things about the Penn Wharton model results with respect to the White House drafts of the Build Back Better agenda, and then I mean the ones that allows certain provisions to expire, is that from an economy-wide look, it actually subtracts modestly from future economic growth. Specifically, hourly wages would grow under the Build Back Better bill, but hours worked would fall and by a greater amount. Are there targeted provisions within the White House Build Back Better agenda that lead to that result, or is that purely just an artifact of the way the bill is financed, which is with debt, and then the drag that's associated with more debt on the economy and the impact on the interest
Yeah,
rates?
no, that's a great question, and that's how to break it down is the financing mechanism and is important here, and the biggest impact on GDP, as you pointed out, over time for the bill as written, not for the scenario where the spending is made permanent. It is the GDP we project by 2031 will be about 0.1%, so 1/10 of 1% smaller, and then a little bit smaller decrease by 2040 and back to about 1/10 of 1% decline by 2050. And so there's competing things going on there. On one hand, you have increases in taxes that do create economic distortions. They create or reallocate capital and disincentivize certain economic activity. You do have the debt effect also happening. That's smaller in this particular scenario, simply because while the debt does go up about 2% relative to what otherwise would have been by 2050, and it has some fiscal drag, even at low interest rates, it will have some fiscal drag. The main economic impact are the tax changes themselves. But what's offsetting that, like if we had no impact of spending on productivity, then the GDP effects would be even more negative. What's offsetting most of it is the fact that we actually have a very detailed modeling of how some of these spending programs will actually increase GDP and labor force participation and so forth. So for example, some of the child tax credits do free up typically secondary earners, typically women in the household, to go back to the labor market, free up some hours there. So even though the net hours do go down, they actually they would be going down even more without that offset to things like the child tax credit and some of the other impacts. If pre-K education has some impact, it actually takes a long time for that to work through the system because of kids being in kindergarten right now. It takes a couple of decades for you to see those effects over time. But nonetheless, all those things do have a positive impacts on productivity over time. And then some of the infrastructure things are actually in this bill and not in the other legislation that was recently passed also have some impact. And so we really detailed model these spending things, both at the micro level, where we go right down to the individual types of households, the impact on them, including some households already would have sent their kids to pre-K. And so we actually see that in the data. Some households don't really need a child tax credit in order for mom to go back to the labor force. And we actually see that and have that in detail. And then other things have these more macro productivity effects. So for the most part, as written, it's mostly a wash in terms of economic performance.
And if some of those provisions are made permanent, like the child tax credit, the earned income tax credit, the healthcare premium tax credit for Obamacare, the universal pre-K child care provisions, if all those things are made permanent, what does your model say to us about the economic effects of this bill in general on the economy?
Yeah, that the permanent structure is where you get much higher costs and you identified some of those drivers, the child tax credit being a significant one. So as written, the child tax credit would cost about $95 billion over 10 years because it's mainly an extension for 1 year. If you extended it over 10 years, though, the child tax credit alone costs about $1.8 trillion. And that's where you see, and a lot of that is because it will come in 2026. The current law child tax credit actually goes down because of the sunset that happened in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So there's even a bigger gap at that point to make up in order to get back to the level that is being trying to achieve for 2022 if we want to stretch that forward. So the macro effects are going to be more negative in the sense that now government debt, instead of going up about 2% relative to the baseline, that is otherwise would have been in 2050. So in our baseline, government debt is still going up, but relative where otherwise would have been, the as written law says it's going to go up by, we project it go up by 2% relative to the increase that already would have happened in the current law. Instead, under this alternative scenario where the spending is made permanent, it goes up by 25%. So now all of a sudden that effect does become more important over time. And so we've been project that GDP would fall by about a little shy of 3% by 2050.